Christmas was quiet until I heard that cry. The silence in the house had been heavy, a thick blanket of solitude that usually settled over us this time of year, undisturbed by the laughter of grandchildren who were miles away in warmer states. I was just staring at the dust motes dancing in a shaft of weak winter sunlight, trying to convince myself that peace was enough, when the sound shattered the calm. It wasn't the wind howling through the eaves or a car backfiring on the slick asphalt. It was something living, something desperate, a high-pitched plea that seemed to slice right through the double-paned glass and hook into my chest. My wife was in the kitchen in Rochester, New York, humming with the radio, and the house had that hollow, holiday silence you get when the kids have their own trees somewhere else. She moved with the slow, practiced rhythm of 40 years in the same room, the smell of cinnamon and clove tea drifting out to join the scent of old pine needles. The quiet wasn't angry, just empty, filling the spaces where tricycle wheels and running feet used to echo on the hardwood floors. It's a specific kind of loneliness that hits you when the decorations are up but the audience is gone, leaving you with nothing but memories and the low hum of a talk show host in the background. I thought that thin sound was just the wind on the siding. The nor'easter had been threatening to blow in all morning, rattling the loose aluminum and whistling through the cracks in the window frames like a ghost trying to get in. My hearing isn't what it used to be, often blurring the edges of conversations or turning distant noises into a meaningless hum, so I was ready to dismiss it. But deep down, a primitive part of my brain pricked up, recognizing a frequency that didn't match the inanimate groan of wood and metal fighting the cold. Then it came again. Higher, raw, a broken note that didn't belong to any storm. It scrapped against the silence of the room, distinct and jagged, carrying a vibration of pain that made the hair on my arm stand up despite the warmth of the heater. It sounded like the very air outside was hurting, a sharp punctuation mark in the gray afternoon that demanded to be acknowledged. I set my coffee cup down with a clatter, the ceramic sound too loud in the stillness, realizing suddenly that this wasn't a noise I could ignore. I opened the front door, and the cold came in like it had been waiting. It rushed past me into the hallway, an aggressive, biting force that smelled of ice and wood smoke, instantly stealing the warmth we'd hoarded all morning. The sudden drop in temperature made my joints ache in protest, a sharp reminder of why I usually stayed deep inside the recliner on days like this. The storm door shuddered in my grip, fighting the wind that seemed determined to rip it from my hand and invite the winter into our sanctuary. I stood there, 67 years old, in worn slippers, listening. The flannel of my robe offered little protection against the gusts, flapping around my legs as I strained to separate the sounds of the neighborhood from the wind. I felt foolish for a moment, an old man chasing noises on a freezing porch, likely looking senile to anyone watching from a warm window across the street. But the feeling in my gut was heavy and undeniable, an anchor keeping me planted on the welcome mat despite the urge to retreat. Not a baby, not a fox, something smaller and scared. It lacked the angry screech of a wild animal fighting for territory, or the rhythmic wail of a child seeking attention. It was a sound of pure, exhausted defeat. It was the vocalization of a creature that had been crying for a long time without an answer, the volume dropping as hope began to fade. I realized with a sinking heart that whatever was out there wasn't just cold, it was giving up. The third cry came from behind the houses off to the left, where the old Miller place sits empty. That house had been vacant for 2 years, a hollow shell with peeling paint and overgrown bushes that caught all the neighborhood trash in the wind. The sound bounced off its rotting siding, creating a ghostly echo that made it hard to pinpoint the source at first. I squinted against the glare of the snow, my eyes watering in the biting air, trying to focus on the shadows stretching across the neglected lawn. There's a narrow gap in the leaning fence between our yards. It was a jagged opening where the wood had rotted away years ago, creating a portal I hadn't looked through since the Miller family moved out and took their noise with them. The snow had piled up against the slats, hiding the bottom of the fence, but that dark vertical slice remained, framing a view I wasn't sure I wanted to see. It looked like a scar in the landscape, a dark invitation to step out of my safe, warm world and into something broken. I shuffled toward it, hand on the rail, that sound pulling me farther than I'd planned to go. My boots, hastily shoved onto bare feet, crunched loudly on the frozen crust of the snow, breaking the pristine, white surface with clumsy, uneven steps. I told myself I would just take a quick look, just enough to satisfy my curiosity, but my feet kept moving past the edge of the porch. The cry acted like a physical tether, reeling me in through the biting wind, overriding the common sense that told me to go back inside and turn up the TV. Through the gap, I saw her. The gray light of the afternoon seemed to pool around her, highlighting the stark contrast of her dark fur against the blinding white ground. At first, my brain refused to process the image, trying to tell me it was just a discarded coat or a pile of leaves blown into a corner. But then the pile moved, a small, involuntary shudder that rippled through the scene and shattered my denial. A German Shepherd puppy, maybe 5 months old, legs buried in snow, a chain running from her collar to a metal stake. She was awkwardly splayed out, her paws tucked deeply underneath her belly in a futile attempt to preserve warmth that was rapidly leaving her. The heavy iron chain looked massive compared to her neck, a cruel industrial weight designed for a junkyard beast, not a puppy whose bones were still growing. It disappeared into the ground like a root, binding her to a patch of earth that offered nothing but frost and wind. No doghouse, no blanket, just a frozen plastic bowl, and a little body shaking so hard her ears trembled. The sheer lack of compassion in the scene took my breath away, more than the cold air. There wasn't even a cardboard box or a rag to separate her from the elements. The red plastic bowl was tipped on its side. A block of ice shaped like the bottom spilled out next to it, proof that water had been there once but was long gone. Her tremors were violent, rhythmic spasms that shook the snow off her back in tiny puffs of white dust. I've seen factories close. I've watched the life drain out of this town slowly, seeing neighbors pack up U-Hauls and boarded-up windows replace flower boxes on Main Street. I've stood in unemployment lines with men who used to run entire shifts, watching the pride fade from their eyes as the winters got harder and the bank accounts got lower. I know what abandonment looks like on a grand, industrial scale, the rust eating away at machinery that used to hum with purpose. I've watched Christmas lights hang over empty porches. There's a specific sadness to a wreath hanging on a door that no one has opened in months, the velvet bow fading in the sun and collecting grime. It's the visual language of a community that is slowly forgetting itself, where traditions are kept up by fewer and fewer people each year. I thought I had grown a thick skin against that kind of visual decay, the callousness of time moving on without us. But that stubborn cry spilling out of that tiny chest into the frozen air cut deeper than all of it. This wasn't the slow, passive decay of a building. This was active, terrifying suffering happening in real time, right under my nose. It was a direct accusation against the silence of the neighborhood, a demand for mercy that made my own comfort feel like a sin. The purity of that distress, coming from something so innocent, shattered the cynical armor I'd built up over decades of watching things fall apart. She noticed me then. Her head snapped up, not with aggression, but with a sudden, jerky movement of total shock, as if she had hallucinated my arrival. The movement dislodged a layer of snow from her shoulders, revealing the dark, wet fur matted underneath. For a split second, the crying stopped, replaced by a tense, held breath that hung in the air between us. Her tail tried to move. It was the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever seen. A tiny, instinctive flicker of optimism buried under layers of freezing trauma. It wasn't a wag, just a low, weak twitch that barely disturbed the snow behind her, but the intention was clear. Even freezing to death, even forgotten, her first instinct upon seeing a human face was to offer a sign of friendship. Those dark eyes found mine, wide and wet, full of one simple question. They weren't angry, and they weren't wild. They were confused, reflecting a profound lack of understanding about why this was happening to her. It was the look a child gives you when they scrape their knee, that utter bewilderment that pain exists in the world and the expectation that you are there to stop it. She looked at me not as a stranger, but as the inevitable answer she had been waiting for, which terrified me. I tightened my grip on the rail and took a slow step toward the broken fence. The wood was rough and splintered under my palm, grounding me in the physical reality of the moment. As my mind raced with excuses to turn back, I knew that crossing that property line meant crossing a moral line too, moving from observer to participant, accepting a responsibility I wasn't sure I could carry. But my boots moved almost on their own, crunching through the icy barrier between my safe indifference and her desperate reality. And as I did, she lifted her head, the chain giving a small clink, and looked straight at me, as if this was the moment someone finally came for her. That metallic sound rang out like a church bell in the quiet yard, a sharp reminder of the physical restraints holding her back. Her gaze didn't waver, locking onto my face with an intensity that stripped away my age, my aches, and my hesitation. In that second, she decided I was her savior, and I knew I couldn't walk away without proving her right. The first thing that told me no was my back. A sharp hot spasm shot up my spine the moment I tried to crouch. A familiar enemy that usually kept me in my chair. It was the accumulation of years of factory work, of lifting things too heavy and standing too long, now screaming at me to stop being a hero. My body was a map of old injuries, and every one of them flared up in protest against the cold and the awkward posture. It protested the moment I leaned over that tired old fence. The vertebrae clicked and grounded, sending a warning signal that if I went down into that snow, I might not be able to get back up on my own. I had to grab the rotting post with both hands to stabilize myself, my knuckles turning white as I fought gravity and arthritis simultaneously. It was a humbling reminder of my own fragility, mirroring the vulnerability of the creature I was trying to reach. But the small shape in the snow didn't care about my age or my excuses. She didn't know about sciatica or blood pressure medication. She only knew the binary reality of presence versus absence. Her need was absolute, cutting through the complex negotiations I was having with my own physical limitations. To her, I wasn't an old man with a bad back. I was a giant, a source of heat, a potential end to the shivering. Up close, she looked even smaller. The distance had hidden the way her ribs were starting to press against her fur, creating hollow shadows along her flank. She was just a baby, a creature that should have been tumbling over wrapping paper and chewing on table legs, not enduring a survival situation. The scale of her suffering against the size of her body made the bile rise in my throat. The chain was so short she could barely turn. It was a cruel tether, likely meant for a much smaller tie-out, that forced her to stay in her own filth and prevented her from curling into a tight ball for warmth. It tangled around her back leg every time she shifted, tripping her up and adding frustration to her misery. The sheer lack of logic in how she was tied, short, heavy, restricting, spoke of negligence so profound it felt intentional. The snow around her was stamped into a hard little circle of paw prints, like she'd been pacing the same prison for days. That circle told the whole story of her last week, a frantic, repetitive loop of walking until exhaustion set in, then waking up to walk again. The snow inside the circle was dirty and packed down to ice, while the snow just inches away remained fluffy and untouched, a mocking reminder of the freedom just out of reach. It was a physical diagram of anxiety, a crop circle of despair carved by tiny, freezing feet. Her metal bowl was just ice now. It was filled with a solid, opaque block that had likely frozen days ago, trapping whatever debris had blown into it. I could see a leaf suspended in the center of the ice. A frozen fossil, proving how long it had been since liquid water had touched that bowl. Licking it would only burn her tongue and lower her body temperature further. A cruel trap disguised as sustenance. And the German Shepherd puppy herself shivered so hard, her whole body quaked, eyes squinting against the wind. It wasn't just a surface shiver. It was a deep, core vibration that seemed to rattle her very bones, blurring her outline against the snow. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy with hypothermia, fighting to stay open as the wind whipped ice crystals into her face. She looked like a candle flame guttering in a draft, flickering wildly before the final darkness. I felt the cold bite into my fingers, but her breathing was what bothered me more. I had forgotten my gloves, and the sensation in my fingertips was rapidly turning from pain to numbness, but I barely registered it. The sound coming from her was a wet, hitching noise, a rattle in the chest that suggested pneumonia was already setting up shop in her lungs. It was the sound of a biological system breaking down, the engine struggling to turn over one last time. Fast, shallow, the kind of breathing that says, "I'm trying, but I'm running out." It was a panic rhythm, too fast to sustain, driving no oxygen into her blood, just exhausting her remaining energy reserves. Every exhale was a tiny white puff of steam that vanished instantly, taking a piece of her life force with it. She was hyperventilating from fear and cold, her small heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Hold on," I said. The words fell out of my mouth before I could check them, spoken to the air as much as to the dog. I needed to verbalize the promise to make it real, to lock myself into a contract of action. It was a command to the universe to pause time, to keep her heart beating for just the few minutes it would take me to gather supplies. Though my voice came out rough, I wasn't sure if I was begging her or myself. It cracked on the syllable, dry from the indoor heat and trembling with a sudden surge of emotion I hadn't expected. I was pleading with my own aging body to move faster, to ignore the pain, to be useful one more time. I was begging her not to die while I turned my back, terrified that breaking eye contact would sever the fragile thread holding her here. I shuffled back to the house, slower than I liked, hand on the railing. Every step away from her felt like a betrayal, a physical weight dragging at my heels. I forced myself to move carefully on the ice, knowing that a fall now would doom both of us, me to a hospital bed and her to that yard. The distance back to the door seemed to have doubled since I came out, stretching into a mile of frozen obstacles. My wife was at the kitchen window, arms folded, watching me, the way you watch a man who's about to lift something he shouldn't. She knew my posture, knew the specific set of my shoulders that meant I was getting involved in something messy. Her face was framed by the frost on the glass, her expression a mix of skepticism and resigned worry. She didn't tap on the glass or wave. She just stood witness, waiting to see what foolishness her husband had found in the snow. When I stepped inside, the warm air fogged my glasses. The transition was blinding, the sudden heat turning the world into a gray, misty blur. I had to rip the spectacles off my face to see, blinking against the sudden sting of the heated room. The smell of the house, roast chicken, and floor wax felt overwhelmingly rich and indulgent compared to the sterile, frozen void I had just left. "You're not planning to save the world out there, are you?" she asked. Her tone was dry, seasoned with years of watching me try to fix broken toasters and stray cats, but there was a softness underneath it. She didn't look up from the tea towel she was folding, but her hands moved slower than usual. She was giving me an out, a chance to say it was nothing and sit back down, though we both knew I wouldn't take it. "We can barely keep up with the grocery list," she added. It was the practical voice of our budget speaking, the voice that counted coupons and worried about the heating bill. She wasn't being cruel. She was being the safeguard of our limited resources, the one who remembered we were on a fixed income. It was a gentle reminder that our hearts were often bigger than our bank account. "I'm just getting her some water," I said. I tried to sound casual, as if I were just watering a plant, minimizing the mission to something small and manageable. I didn't want to admit yet that I was already planning a rescue, that I had mentally already adopted the problem. I focused on the immediate task, hydration, because looking at the bigger picture was too overwhelming. The word sounded thin, even to me. It hung in the warm kitchen air, obviously inadequate for the magnitude of suffering I had just witnessed. Water was a band-aid on a bullet wound, and we both knew it, but it was the only first step I could take. I avoided her eyes, focusing intently on the faucet handle, afraid that if I looked at her, I'd confess the whole impossible plan. I filled a bowl with warm tap water, scraped some leftover chicken and rice onto a plate. I let the water run over my wrist first, testing the temperature like it was a baby's bottle, making sure it wasn't hot enough to shock her system. The chicken was from last night's dinner, meant for sandwiches, but I piled it high, shredding the meat with my fingers to make it easier to swallow. It felt like a sacred offering, this plate of simple food, the only currency I had to trade for her life. She sighed, long and tired, then reached for a small towel. It was the sound of capitulation, the moment she decided to stop being the voice of reason and start being my partner. She opened the drawer where we kept the rag towels, the ones used for muddy boots and spills, selecting one that was soft but worn. That small gesture, handing me the towel, was her signature on the contract, her silent agreement to aid and abet. "Put this on the steps," she muttered. "I don't want to see you flat on your back because of one slip." She wasn't talking about the dog anymore. She was protecting me, her primary concern, always shifting back to the fragile ecosystem of our own lives. She tucked the towel into my pocket with a rough pat, a gesture of affection disguised as fussing. It was her way of saying, "Go ahead, but come back in one piece." Outside again, the cold hit harder, but so did the memory of her shaking. The second exposure to the freezing air felt more brutal than the first, shocking my skin, which had just started to relax. but the image of that trembling puppy burned behind my eyelids, generating a heat of its own that propelled me forward. I wasn't just walking into the cold, I was walking toward a purpose, which warms you in a way a coat never can. I laid the towel on the top step, then made my way to the gap in the fence, holding the bowl like something fragile. I moved with the exaggerated caution of a waiter carrying a tray through a crowded room, terrified of spilling a single drop of the precious warm water. Steam rose from the bowl, a tiny banner of life in the dead landscape, curling around my face. I focused entirely on my feet, placing each boot deliberately, balancing the need for speed with the need for safety. "Easy, sweetheart," I said, as I set the food and water just within reach of the chain. I knelt down, ignoring the protest of my knees, and pushed the bowls across the invisible line of her territory. I kept my movements slow and fluid, trying to project a calm I didn't feel, signaling that I wasn't a threat. I wanted her to smell the food before she smelled my fear. "I'm not here to hurt you." I whispered it like a prayer, needing her to understand the intent behind the action. Animals know tone better than language, and I tried to pitch my voice into that low, rumbling register that means safety. I held my hands up, palms open, showing her I held no weapons, no cutters, no chain, just an offering. For a moment she stayed frozen in place, like even hope might be a trick. She looked at the steaming bowl, then at me, then back at the bowl, her brain unable to process the sudden appearance of warmth. She had been disappointed so many times that trust was a dangerous gamble she wasn't ready to take. She stood rigid, vibrating with tension, waiting for the catch, waiting for the food to be snatched away. Then her nose lifted. The scent of the warm chicken hit her, cutting through the frostbite and the fear, triggering a primal survival instinct that overrode her hesitation. Her nostrils flared, twitching as she pulled in the aroma, her eyes widening as the reality of the food set in. It was the smell of life, of calories, of a future beyond this freezing afternoon. She took one slow step, then another, trembling all the way, until she reached the bowl and began to drink like the world might end any second. The water was gone in seconds, her tongue lapping frantically, splashing it over her snout in her haste. She didn't chew the chicken, she inhaled it, her whole body jerking with the effort of swallowing huge mouthfuls. It was a desperate, messy consumption that broke my heart, showing just how empty she really was. I told myself I was just helping her get through this cold spell. I built a wall of denial right there in the snow, telling myself this was a temporary intervention, not a permanent change. I wasn't stealing a dog. I wasn't adopting a dog. I was just a neighbor doing a good deed. It was a lie necessary to keep me from panicking about the legalities and the logistics of what I was doing. One day, maybe two, enough to keep the weather from doing what people had started. I bargained with fate, setting a mental timeline that I knew I wouldn't keep. Just until the storm passes, I thought. Just until the owners come back. But deep down, looking at the way she looked at me over the empty bowl, one knew the timeline had already vanished. I went back to the house, feeling heavier than when I'd left. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a profound sadness that settled in my gut like a stone. I had bought her a few hours of warmth, but I hadn't solved the problem, and the incompleteness of the act weighed on me. Leaving her there, even with a full belly, felt like a crime. I closed the door gently, the latch clicking into place, and for a heartbeat the old quiet settled over the rooms again. The barrier was back up, the warmth sealed inside, the problem sealed outside. The house felt too quiet now, the silence accusing rather than peaceful. I stood in the hallway, dripping melted snow onto the rug, unable to move back into my normal routine. Then that same thin cry rose up from the yard, cutting straight through the walls, as if she was calling me back and asking why I'd ever left her there at all. It was louder this time, fueled by the energy of the food I'd just given her. It wasn't just a cry of pain anymore, it was a cry of betrayal. She had tasted kindness, and now the absence of it was even more unbearable. We got used to her crying the way you get used to the ticking clock in the kitchen. It became the background track of our lives, a constant, rhythmic reminder of the failure next door. You learn to filter it out to survive, to talk over it, to turn up the volume on the television. But it's a corrosive kind of adaptation, one that eats away at your peace of mind while you pretend everything is normal. At first, it sliced through the house. Every yelp felt like it was happening in our living room, making us jump and look toward the window. It disrupted our reading, our meals, our sleep, demanding attention we were trying not to give. It was a jagged edge in our soft, comfortable life, tearing at the fabric of our daily routine. After a few days, it just became part of the noise of winter in Rochester, New York. It blended in with the scraping of snowplows and the howling of the wind. Just another sound of a harsh season. We normalized the suffering because we felt powerless to stop it, retreating into that passive acceptance that allows bad things to continue. We stopped saying, "Did you hear that?" and started just exchanging guilty glances. On the calendar by the fridge, my wife started drawing small dots on each square. 1 dot for every day we carried food and warm water to that German Shepherd puppy over the fence. It was a ledger of survival, a tiny black mark recording that she was still there and we were still watching. The dots accumulated, turning a week into a month, a visual representation of the neglect dragging on. It was my wife's way of bearing witness, of making sure the days didn't just blur into nothingness. After a while, there was a crooked line of dots like a trail of tiny promises we hadn't planned on making. The line snaked across the grid of December, heading relentlessly toward Christmas. Each dot represented a trip into the cold, a bowl of food, a moment of connection. We were tethered to her now, bound by ink and routine, involved in a long-term relationship we hadn't signed up for. Some mornings she went out instead of me, wrapped in her old coat, muttering that her knees hurt less than mine that day. She'd bundle up in her oversized parka, looking like a fierce, gray-haired warrior heading into battle. I'd watch her from the window, struggling through the drifts, and love her more in those moments than I had in years. She pretended to be annoyed by the chore, but I saw the way she lingered at the fence, talking to the air. She'd come back in with red cheeks and say she ate everything, still shaking. She would report the details, like a nurse on rounds. Ate the kibble, drank the water, looked a bit better. We analyzed her condition over breakfast, discussing a dog we didn't own, as if she were our grandchild. The shaking became the barometer of our day. If she was shaking less, it was a good morning. We never called her by a name. We were superstitious, afraid that naming her would make the attachment permanent and the inevitable loss harder. Naming is a claiming act, a magic that turns an object into a family member. We resisted it with a stubbornness born of self-preservation, trying to keep a wall between our hearts and the yard next door. We just said she, like the universe should already know who we meant. Did you feed her? Is she quiet? The pronoun became heavy with specific meaning, containing all our worry and guilt. In our house, she was the center of gravity, the invisible sun we were orbiting around. Every now and then, a truck would pull into that empty driveway. It was a rusted pickup that sounded like it was coughing up gravel, breaking the silence with aggressive mechanical noise. The headlights would sweep across our living room wall, making us stiffen in our chairs. We'd freeze, waiting to see if this was the moment of salvation or just another cruelty. A man would get out, toss something toward the bowl, and leave before the engine had time to cool. He moved with the hurried, guilty body language of someone doing a chore they despised. He didn't check on her, didn't pet her, just threw dry kibble onto the snow like he was feeding chickens. It was a transaction, not a caretaking, done only to keep her alive enough to avoid legal trouble. He never knelt, never spoke. There was no softness in him, no recognition of the sentient being at the end of the chain. He treated her like a piece of equipment stored outside, checking her status with a glance and moving on. The lack of interaction was almost worse than the cold. It was a total denial of her existence as a living thing. Sometimes he didn't even look in her direction. He would walk to the back shed, grab a tool, and drive off, ignoring the frantic tail wagging and the hopeful yip from the fence. That indifference was a special kind of violence, erasing her even while he stood 10 feet away. It taught her that her voice didn't matter, that her presence was invisible. Seeing that did something sour to my stomach that no age ever cured. It wasn't just anger, it was a physical nausea, a revulsion at the casual cruelty of men. You think you've seen it all by the time you hit 60, but the sight of a man ignoring a crying puppy triggers a fresh, raw rage. It made me want to go out there and shout, to shake him, to demand he look at what he was doing. At night, when the house settled and the pipes clicked, I kept seeing another dog in my mind. The quiet of the bedroom became a theater for memories, projecting old images onto the ceiling. The rhythm of the heater reminded me of other winters, other dogs, blurring the line between the past and the present. I lay there, haunted not just by the dog outside, but by the ghosts of dogs long gone. When I was a boy in a small town, there was a mutt who waited for me outside the school. He was a scruffy thing, coat full of burrs, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped over. He didn't belong to anyone, really, but he belonged to the routine of my day. He was the first reliable thing I ever knew, a constant in a chaotic childhood world. Rain or snow, right by the cracked step. He was an anchor in the storm of adolescence, waiting with a patience that humans rarely possess. I'd come out the double doors, clutching my books, and there he'd be, shaking off the water, tail thumping a greeting against the concrete. It didn't matter if I'd failed a test or lost a fight. To him, I was always the main event. No one told him to. There was no training, no treats involved, just a mysterious, voluntary loyalty that I couldn't explain. He had chosen me out of hundreds of kids, a random selection that made me feel special for the first time in my life. It was a gift of pure grace, unearned and unconditional. He just decided I was his job. He took his duty seriously, trotting beside me with a protective air, growling at squirrels and checking the perimeter. He gave himself a purpose, escorting me home, and that purpose gave him dignity. He taught me that love is often just the act of showing up, over and over again. On the worst days, when the shouting at home started before I even took off my shoes, he'd press his side against my leg and walk me all the way to the creek, like he knew I needed a different kind of silence. He could smell the tension on me, sensing the vibrations of a turbulent household before we even reached the driveway. He would steer me away from the front door, nudging me toward the woods where the water ran clear and the shouting couldn't reach us. He offered his warm flank as a physical barrier between me and the world, a silent promise that I wasn't fighting it alone. I thought about that old dog each time this puppy crept a little closer. The memory overlaid the reality, superimposing that old mutt's face onto the German shepherd's. I was looking for that same spark, that same desire for connection, in her eyes. I wondered if she had the potential to be that kind of guardian, if only someone gave her the chance. At first, she'd snatch the food and jump back, chain rattling. She was feral with hunger, treating the food like stolen contraband she had to secure before the trap sprung. She would lunge, grab a mouthful, and retreat to the limit of her radius to chew, watching me with suspicious eyes. It was a dance of survival, born of the lesson that nothing good comes without a price. Then, slowly she began to linger by the fence, head tilted, listening while I stood there and talked about nothing in particular. The food became secondary to the company. She'd eat a little, then look up, her ears swiveling to catch the cadence of my voice. She started to associate my presence not just with calories, but with a break in the monotony. She was starving for sound, for interaction, for the feeling of being addressed. The weather, the neighbors, how the snow was deeper this year. I rambled about the mundane details of life, just to keep the sound waves flowing between us. I told her about the price of gas, the leak in the roof, the way my hip ached when it rained. It didn't matter what I said. The tone was the message, a steady stream of reassurance that said, I am here, and you are here, and we are together. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the way my voice softened for her. She read the frequency of kindness, the drop in pitch that signals safety to a mammal. Her posture changed, the tension leaving her shoulders, her tail lowering from a tuck to a relaxed curve. She was learning a new language, one where human voices didn't mean shouting or commands, but comfort. Most evenings, I'd sit at the kitchen table while my wife knitted in her chair by the window. It was our tableau of aging, a scene of domestic stillness under the yellow glow of the lamp. The needles clicked a rhythmic counterpoint to the silence, knitting together yarn and time. We were together, yet both of our minds were outside in the dark, pulled by the gravity of the yard next door. The Christmas lights from the street threw faint colors against the glass. Red and green blurs washed over the frost on the window pane, festive ghosts trying to cheer up a somber room. They reminded me of the season we were in, a season of miracles and charity that felt increasingly at odds with the reality over the fence. The cheerful twinkling felt almost mocking, a superficial joy painted over a deep, freezing sorrow. Out past our yard, in the dim patch of the Miller place, I could see her shape in the snow, a dark curl against all that white, still chained, still waiting. She was a smudge of ink on a pristine page, a flaw in the perfect winter landscape. The moonlight caught the metal of the chain, glinting like a harsh silver thread, binding her to the earth. She looked like a statue of endurance, carved from cold and shadow. The TV mumbled in the corner, some cheerful host talking about holiday travel. The studio audience laughed at jokes I didn't hear, their applause sounding tinny and distant. It was a window into a parallel universe, where the biggest problem was a flight delay or a burnt turkey. The contrast between that bright, fake world and the dying dog outside was jarring. And then the weatherman's tone dropped. The graphics on the screen changed from sunny maps to angry swirls of blue and purple. The banter stopped, replaced by the serious, urgent delivery used for disasters. He leaned into the camera, his expression grave, shifting from entertainment to warning. "Coldest Christmas we've seen in years," he said. "Dangerous wind chills. Stay inside if you can." He pointed to the numbers plummeting on the map, digits that meant frostbite in minutes. He talked about bringing pets indoors, covering pipes, checking on the elderly. It was a warning for the living to hide, a declaration of war from the atmosphere. I looked from the screen, to the window, to that small shadow in the yard next door. The connection was instant and terrifying. The forecast wasn't just weather. It was a death sentence. The numbers on the screen translated directly into a timeline for her survival. I measured the distance between the warmth of the cathode ray tube and the freezing reality of the dog, and the gap felt impossible to bridge. The chain, the empty bowl, the way she tucked herself into her own ribs for warmth. I saw her trying to make herself smaller, to minimize the surface area exposed to the biting wind. She was doing everything biology had taught her to survive, but biology wasn't enough against minus 20 degrees on a short chain. She was fighting a battle she couldn't win, armed only with fur and a heartbeat. "She won't live through this," I heard myself say quietly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, spoken to the empty air. The words hung there, heavy and final, stripping away the last of our denial. Admitting it out loud changed everything. It turned inaction into complicity. And for the first time, the ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than her cry. Her silence was more deafening than her howling had ever been. The clock counted down the seconds of her remaining life, each talk a hammer blow. The house felt pressurized, the air thick with the knowledge of what was coming. The older you get, the more you learn to live with, but not with the sound of someone shaking alone in the dark. You learn to live with aches, with loss, with the world changing faster than you can keep up. You accept that you can't fix everything, that tragedy is part of the deal. But there is a line, a specific frequency of suffering, that bypasses all your cynical defenses and hits the raw nerve of your humanity. That night, after the weather report about record cold, I sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand longer than I cared to admit. The plastic receiver felt heavy and sweaty in my grip, a physical link to a system I didn't trust. I rehearsed what I would say, trying to find words that would sound urgent enough to compel action but calm enough not to sound crazy. I stared at the keypad, my finger hovering over the buttons, paralyzed by the fear that making the call wouldn't change anything. Finally, I dialed the animal control number printed on a faded magnet stuck to our fridge. The magnet was from a pizza place that closed 10 years ago, but the emergency numbers on the bottom were still legible. I punched in the digits slowly, listening to the tone of each one, a digital code for help. It felt like sending a message in a bottle, casting hope into a bureaucratic void. A polite woman answered. Her voice was warm, professional, the voice of someone sitting in a heated office with a headset. She identified the department and asked how she could help, following a script designed to categorize misery. I imagined her typing on a keyboard, filling out fields on a screen, detached from the freezing reality I was describing. I told her about the German Shepherd puppy next door. I described the lack of shelter, the frozen water, the shivering that never stopped. I tried to paint a picture with words, to make her see the snow-packed circle and the short chain. I wanted her to feel the cold through the telephone line. The chain, the frozen bowl, the way she cried when the wind picked up. I listed the evidence, like a prosecutor, building a case for intervention. I emphasized the neglect, hoping to trigger some legal threshold that would mandate a response. I wanted to scream, but I kept listing facts. Ice, metal, wind, bone. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it kept catching on the word chained. That word stuck in my throat, heavy with the weight of the metal it described. It represented the cruelty of the situation, not just the cold, but the inability to escape it. My voice wavered, betraying the desperate emotion fueling the call, revealing just how much this dog had already gotten under my skin. "We've logged the address," she said. It was the standard administrative response, a phrase meant to placate without promising. It meant, "We wrote it down," not "we are coming." It was a data entry action, not a rescue mission. "We're getting a lot of calls with this cold coming in. We'll try to send someone out as soon as we can." She was managing expectations, preparing me for disappointment. The cold had triggered a crisis across the county, and one puppy was just a ticket number in a stack of tragedies. Her try was a soft no, a buffer against liability. As soon as we can. Those words are made for people who have time. They are the words of bureaucracy, of queues and priority lists and shift changes. They work for potholes or noise complaints, not for a living creature whose blood is turning to ice. To the freezing dog, as soon as we can, was an eternity. I thanked her anyway and hung up, feeling more useless than relieved. The click of the line disconnecting felt like a door slamming shut. I had done the right thing, the legal thing, and it felt completely empty. I hadn't saved her. I had just filed a report about her death. My wife set a mug of tea down in front of me. She placed it carefully on a coaster, the steam rising between us like a white flag. She didn't ask what they said. She could read the slump of my shoulders. The tea was her way of saying, "I'm here," a small comfort in a helpless moment. "You called," she said. "That's something." She was trying to offer absolution, to validate the effort even if the result was failure. She wanted me to feel like I had done my duty so I could sleep that night. It was a kindness, but it felt hollow. "It's not enough," I answered. The truth tasted bitter. A phone call doesn't warm a body. A log entry doesn't block the wind. I knew, with a terrifying clarity, that the system had failed, and the burden was back on us. "We've done what we can," she told me softly. "We're not 20 anymore. We can't fix everything." She touched my hand, her skin papery and cool, reminding me of our shared limitations. She was the anchor to reality, pleading with me to accept the boundaries of our age and our power. She was afraid for me, afraid I would break myself trying to fix the unfixable. I didn't argue, but the picture of that puppy curled in the snow wouldn't leave my mind. It was burned into my retina, a static image of misery that overlaid everything I looked at. I looked at the stove and saw the frozen bowl. One looked at the rug and saw the snow. The image was persistent and demanding, refusing to be filed away with the, quote, completed tasks. When we went to bed, the house felt too warm compared to the yard outside. The duvet felt heavy and suffocating, the heat from the vent feeling like an unearned luxury. I kicked off the blankets, then pulled them back up, trapped in a cycle of guilt. Every degree of warmth I enjoyed felt like something I was stealing from her. The contrast made it hard to breathe. The disparity between my comfort and her agony created a pressure in my chest. I lay there hyper-aware of the insulation in the walls, the roof over my head, the miracle of central heating. It felt wrong to be safe when she was so close and so exposed. The wind started up later, whistling around the corners of the house like it remembered some old grudge. It was a predatory sound, hunting for cracks to enter, scratching at the shingles. It sounded personal, a malevolent force scouring the earth. I imagined what that wind sounded like, with no walls to stop it. I lay awake, watching the ceiling, thinking about another winter. The shadows from the streetlights played across the plaster, forming shapes that looked like memories. My mind drifted back decades, seeking a precedent for this feeling, a time when I had felt this cold and this desperate. I went back to the darkest year of our lives. My first Christmas after the plant closed, when I came home with a cardboard box of tools and no idea what I'd tell the kids. I remembered the weight of that box, the shame burning in my gut as I walked up the driveway. The snow had been deep that year too, mirroring the freeze in our bank account. I felt like a failure as a provider, terrified of the future. We had almost nothing that year. The tree was small, cut from the woods, and the presents were mostly handmade or secondhand. The fear of eviction hung over the house like a damp fog. We ate simple meals and huddled together to save on oil, stripping life down to the basics of survival. The oven ran low, the bills ran high, and the only warm thing in the house some nights was the little dog who slept pressed against our feet under the blankets. That dog was a radiator of hope, generating heat when we couldn't afford it. She didn't know we were poor. She only knew we were her pack. Her warmth was the one abundant resource we had. She was small, not much to look at, but she kept the cold from settling in our bones. She was a terrier mix, scruffy and loud, but in bed she was a solid brick of devotion. She moved between the kids, beds, and ours, stitching the family together with her presence. She absorbed our stress and gave back unconditional love. Sometimes I think she held our family together just by breathing. Her steady rhythm gave us a tempo to live by when everything else was chaotic. She was the reminder that life goes on, that sleep comes, that morning follows night. She saved us simply by existing and needing us. I got up and opened the old photo box in the hallway. The cardboard lid was soft with age, the corners taped up. I dug through the jumble of black and white snapshots and faded Polaroids, looking for proof of that time. I needed to see her face again, to remind myself of the debt I owed to dogs. There we were, the kids, still small, faces lit by tree lights. They looked so young, so unaware of how close we were to the edge. The photo captured a moment of defiance against the poverty, a circle of light in a dark year. And there, in the corner of the frame, was the blur of a tail. That same dog sprawled under the coffee table like she owned the place. She looked content, belly up, trusting us completely to keep the world safe for her. She didn't know the heat might get cut off, she just knew the carpet was soft. Seeing her relaxed form made my throat tighten with a mix of gratitude and grief. Back then, I thought the years ahead would be loud and endless. I thought the house would always be full of noise, of struggle, of life. I couldn't imagine a time when the rooms would be empty and the silence would be the problem. I took the chaos for granted, not knowing it was the best part. Now the house echoed, and a puppy shivered 1 yard away, like none of that had ever happened. The silence of the hallway felt accusatory, amplifying the contrast between the memory and the moment. The ghost of the dog that saved us seemed to be pointing at the dog that needed saving. The circle had closed, and it was my turn to pay it back. By morning, the cold had a different sharpness to it, like the air itself was fragile. The sky was a hard, pale blue, deceptive in its brightness. The sun offered light but no heat, shining on a world that had turned to glass. It was the kind of cold that snaps branches and freezes breath in the throat before you can exhale. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside, each breath turning to smoke. The zipper felt stiff and freezing against my chin. My breath hung in the air in thick white clouds, lingering like unspoken words. I braced myself against the drop in temperature, squinting against the glare. The snow squeaked under my boots as I walked to the gap in the fence. It was a high-pitched, dry sound, the sound of snow that has lost all moisture and become powder. The yard was eerily still, the wind having died down to leave a vacuum of freezing air. I dreaded what I would find, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm. She was still there. The shape was the same, but the energy was gone. She hadn't moved to greet me, hadn't lifted her head at the sound of the door. She was a dark mound in the snow, a part of the landscape now, almost buried by the drift. The same little body, only now she barely moved at all. The shivering had stopped, which terrified me more than the shaking. It meant her body had given up the fight to generate heat, entering the final stages of shutting down. She looked deflated, smaller, as if the cold had eroded her substance. Snow had clumped in her fur, crusted around her collar. Ice balls hung from her belly fur, dragging her down. A layer of frost coated her back, showing that she hadn't moved enough to shake it off. She was beginning to look like something discarded, something inanimate. Her chain was locked into the ice, leading to a stake that looked welded to the frozen ground. The metal links had sunk into the snow and frozen solid, reducing her range of motion to zero. She was pinned to the earth, trapped by physics as much as by the collar. The stake looked like a tombstone marker in the white field. For a long second, I couldn't tell if her chest was rising. I stared, holding my own breath, willing her to move. I looked for the tiny puff of steam, the slight expansion of the rib cage. Time stretched out, suspended in the silence of the morning. That was the first moment I thought, clear as day. If I wait for someone else to come, I might be too late. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The cavalry wasn't coming. The authorities were busy. The owner didn't care. It was just me and the ice. Sometimes age doesn't give you the luxury of thinking things through. We spend our lives weighing consequences, saving for retirement, being careful. But in a crisis, wisdom isn't about deliberation. It's about recognition. You see the truth and you act, or you don't. You just wake up one morning, look at what the world is doing, and realize that if you don't move now, you'll be too late. The deadline had arrived. There was no more. Tomorrow, no more. Wait and see. The clock had run out, and the decision was making itself. I tried calling animal control again. I went back inside, fingers numb, and dialed the number with a desperate hope. I needed permission. I needed backup. I needed someone to tell me it was okay to intervene. I wanted the law on my side before I broke it. Same number, same cold plastic under my fingers. The familiarity of the phone felt mocking now. The buttons felt stiff. I stood in the kitchen, watching the steam rise from my wife's coffee, feeling like an intruder in my own calm life. This time, it didn't even ring to a person, just an automated voice wishing me happy holidays and asking me to leave a message. The cheerful robotic voice was a slap in the face. Happy holidays sounded grotesque against the reality of the dying dog. It was the ultimate symbol of a system that had closed up shop for the season, leaving the vulnerable to fend for themselves. I left my name, our address in Rochester, and the words German Shepherd puppy chained in the yard, barely moving. I spoke clearly, enunciating every word, leaving a verbal trail of evidence. I wanted there to be a record of the emergency, a timestamp on the neglect. I sounded calm, but my hand was shaking. But my own voice sounded far away, like it already knew no one was coming today. I heard the futility in my own tone. I was talking to a machine that wouldn't be checked until Monday. I was shouting into a void, and the void was answering with silence. When I set the phone down, my wife was watching me from her chair by the window. She hadn't moved, but her attention was focused entirely on me. She had her reading glasses on, but she wasn't reading. She was waiting for me to catch up to the conclusion she had already reached. We didn't say anything at first. The silence between us was heavy with understanding. We had been married 40 years. We didn't need a debate to know what the other was thinking. We communicated in glances and sighs, a shorthand of a lifetime together. We just listened to the wind press against the glass. It was picking up again, a low moan that rattled the panes. It was the sound of the enemy at the gate. It was the sound of the time running out. If we don't do something, I finally said, we're going to look at that spot of snow for the rest of our lives and know what's under it. I voiced the haunting that would follow us if we did nothing. I knew that looking out that window would become a torture, a daily reminder of cowardice. The yard would become a graveyard in our minds, haunting our coffee and our quiet mornings forever. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and nodded once. It was a solemn nod, a judge handing down a verdict. She accepted the burden, the risk, the trouble. She chose the haunting of action over the haunting of regret. Get your coat, she said. I'll find the old blanket. She stood up with a newfound energy, the decision made. She moved with purpose, heading to the linen closet. She was no longer an observer. She was the logistics manager of a rescue operation. I took the rusted wire cutters from the hook in the garage, the ones I used to use on garden fencing. They were heavy, orange-handled things, stiff with disuse and cold grease. I squeezed the handles, testing the mechanism, praying they were sharp enough for heavy chain. They felt like a weapon in my hand, a tool of liberation. She brought out a heavy wool blanket that used to live on our bed when the kids were small. It smelled of cedar and attic dust. It was a thick, scratchy tartan, improved by years of washing. It was a blanket with a history of keeping people warm, ready for one more job. We stepped out together. We looked like a strange pair of burglars, armed with blankets and pliers in broad daylight. We walked shoulder to shoulder, united in our minor crime. The neighbors' houses were closed and quiet, their blinds drawn against the cold. Her hand looped through my arm to steady both of us. The ice was treacherous, and we leaned on each other for balance. It was a physical representation of our marriage, propping each other up when the footing got slippery. We moved as a single four-legged entity, slow but determined. The cold bit hard as we crossed into the neighbor's yard. Crossing that property line felt momentous. We were trespassing, we were breaking the law, but the cold was the only law that mattered right now, and we were answering to it. Up close, the puppy looked even smaller against the white ground, her fur crusted with ice, eyes dull but still tracking us. She didn't lift her head, but her eyes followed our movement. There was no hope in them, just a dull observation of her final moments. She was witnessing her own end, too tired to be afraid. When we spoke, we kept our voices low, and sure, like we were talking to a frightened child. We narrated our movements to keep her calm. "It's okay," we murmured. "We're coming." We projected a bubble of safety with our tone, trying to envelop her in it before we even touched her. "Hey there, sweetheart," I murmured. "We're here now. We're going to get you out of this." I crouched down, my knees popping, ignoring the pain. I wanted to be on her level, to show her I wasn't a threat from above. I wanted my face to be the first thing she saw when she came back to the world of the living. Her head lifted with effort, and her tail gave the tiniest, tired twitch, as if she wanted to believe us but hadn't quite decided. It was a microscopic movement, but it was enough. It was a spark in the ashes. She was telling us she was still in there, buried under the ice. I saw the worn circle in the snow, where she'd walked the same steps over and over, the chain cutting a groove into the ground. The geometry of her suffering was clear in the daylight. The trench was perfectly round, a testament to endless frantic pacing. It was a prison cell made of nothing but routine and restraint. No fresh straw, no sign of real shelter, just the record of how long she'd been forgotten. The lack of care was absolute. There wasn't even a token effort to keep her warm. It was a scene of pure abandonment, clear as a written confession. I knelt as far as my knees would allow and put my hand on the frozen metal link near her collar. The metal burned my skin, sucking the heat straight out of my hand. It was an intimate connection with the instrument of her torture. I gripped it hard, feeling the weight of it, the unjust heaviness of it on her small neck. If someone shows up right now and tells me to stop, I thought, feeling the cold burn into my palm, I'm not letting go. A fierce protectiveness surged through me, a stubborn old man rage. I would have fought the owner right there in the snow. I would have fought the police. I had crossed the Rubicon. The sound of the chain dropping into the snow was louder than any Christmas bell I've ever heard. Snip. The tension released instantly. The chain slithered off her neck and hit the ground with a heavy, dead sound. It was the sound of freedom, unmusical, but beautiful. It was just a small clink and a dull thud, but it felt like the whole yard took a breath. The atmosphere changed instantly. The tether was severed. The geometry of the circle was broken. The world opened up. The last link gave way under the cutters, and for a second, nothing happened. I held my breath, waiting for her to bolt. I expected a reaction, a leap, a bark. But trauma doesn't disappear just because the lock is broken. The German Shepherd puppy just stood there, head low, like her body hadn't caught up to the news that she was free. She was still mentally chained. She didn't know she could move. She waited for the jerk of the collar that never came. "Come on, sweetheart," I said quietly. "You're not tied anymore." I beckoned her with a gloved hand. I invited her into the rest of the world. I offered her permission to step out of the circle. She took one shaky step forward, then another. She tested the boundaries of the invisible wall. She expected the resistance. When it didn't come, she looked confused. I thought she might run, bolt for the open space she'd been staring at for 20 days. I was ready to chase her. I thought instinct would take over and send her flying toward the horizon. I braced myself for a pursuit. Instead, her legs folded. The adrenaline that had been holding her up vanished. The realization of safety allowed her to collapse. She didn't fall from weakness. She fell from relief. She crumpled right against my knees, all bone and cold fur and silent trust, like she'd poured whatever was left of her strength straight into me. She leaned her entire weight into my shins. She surrendered. She gave me the burden of her life, saying, "I can't do this anymore, you carry it." I dropped the cutters and slid the blanket under her, my hands clumsy in the freezing air. I wrapped her like a burrito, tucking the wool tight. I wanted to seal in every calorie she had left. I treated her like breakable glass. That old wool had covered our kids on long winter nights. It had a legacy of warmth. It had comforted fevers and nightmares. Now it was doing its most important work yet. Now it wrapped around this trembling body as if it had just been waiting for another job. The fabric seemed to embrace her. It was a transfer of family history, wrapping the stray in the same cloth that held our children. It was an adoption ceremony performed in wool. My wife knelt as far as her joints allowed and tucked the edges in around the puppy's paws. She fussed over the corners, making sure no air could get in. She touched the puppy's face with a gentle, mothering hand. She was claiming her. "Oh, you poor girl," she whispered, voice breaking on the last word. The tears finally came, freezing on her cheeks. She saw the full extent of the damage up close. Her heart broke open right there on the snow. For the first time, the puppy answered with more than a cry. It wasn't a sound. It was a gesture. It was a communication of gratitude. She lifted her muzzle just an inch and gave the lightest, uncertain lick against my wife's wrist, as if to say she'd heard every soft thing we'd said to her through that fence. That rough, dry tongue on skin was a contract sealed. It was an acknowledgement of the voice that had kept her alive. It was the first act of love she had strength to perform. We carried her carefully to the car, my arms screaming under the weight but my chest feeling strangely light. She was heavier than she looked, dead weight in the blanket. My biceps burned, my back flared, but I felt strong. I felt like I was carrying the Holy Grail. My wife held the doors and fussed with the blanket, making sure no draft could find its way in. She ran ahead, opening the car, blasting the heat. She created a warm capsule for transport. She was the advance guard. On the drive to the clinic, the world outside blurred by in white and gray. I drove with intense focus, ignoring the speed limit. The snowbanks, the houses, the trees were just scenery. My world had narrowed to the bundle in the back seat. Inside, all I could feel was the warmth slowly coming back into the bundle on my lap. My wife held her as I drove, but I could feel the heat radiating from the heater vents. The shivering was changing frequency. The thaw had begun. Her breathing, at first ragged and fast, began to settle into a slower rhythm against my ribs. The panic was receding. The air was filling her lungs without the bite of frost. She was realizing she wasn't going to die today. My own heart was pounding so hard it almost embarrassed me, like I was some kid sneaking out on his first adventure. I felt alive. The rush of breaking the rules, of saving a life, washed away the gray numbness of old age. I was a hero in a Buick. When we finally carried her through the clinic doors, the vet looked from the puppy in my arms to our faces, taking in the whole silent story in one long glance. He saw the snow on our coats, the old blanket, the look of desperate determination. He didn't ask for paperwork. He knew a rescue when he saw one. He laid a gentle hand on her side, listened, then met my eyes and said quietly, "She's going to make it. But what happens next? That part is going to be up to you." He put the ball in our court. He offered a prognosis and a challenge. He saved the body, but he knew the soul needed a home. The scariest thing about an old person's house isn't the silence. It's how quickly you get used to it. You adapt to the lack of disruption. You start to protect your peace too fiercely. You forget that noise is often the sound of life happening. They kept the German Shepherd puppy at the clinic for a couple of days to warm her up, treat the frostbite, make sure her heart and lungs were strong enough to carry her forward. We visited, but we slept at home. The house felt huge without her. The yard felt haunted by the empty circle. The vet talked about fluids and monitoring and numbers on charts. He spoke in medical jargon, explaining creatinine levels and core temperatures. He showed us x-rays and blood work. We listened politely to the science. We just nodded because we didn't have the right questions, only the right feeling. We didn't care about the numbers. We just wanted to know if her eyes were bright. We trusted our gut more than the charts. When we walked back out into the parking lot without her, my arms felt strangely empty. The muscle memory of her weight lingered. I missed the burden. I felt lighter, but not in a good way. That old wool blanket lay folded on the back seat, holding the outline of where she'd been. It was a ghost of the puppy. It held her shape and her smell, It was an empty shell waiting to be filled again. At home, the house opened its mouth and swallowed us again. We stepped back into the quiet. The clock ticked. The fridge hummed. The routine tried to reassert itself. My wife set 2 cups of tea on the table, like always. The ceramic clinked on the wood. The steam rose. It was the ritual of our evenings, but the meaning had drained out of it. Steam rose between them, and nothing else moved. The air was stagnant. The stillness was oppressive. We sat there, 2 statues in a museum of our own making. The blanket ended up draped over the arm of my chair without either of us really deciding. It just migrated there. It became a focal point. We both looked at it, pretending we weren't. I could still smell her on it. It was a scent of wet fur, pine, and sickness. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. It was the smell of a life we had touched. Not the sharp shelter smell yet, just cold and fear and something young that hadn't had a chance to be anything else. It was the smell of raw potential. It was the smell of a slate waiting to be written on. It was the smell of Leora before she was Leora. That night I lay in bed and listened the way you do when you think you've heard a noise. I was tuned to a frequency that was no longer broadcasting. I was waiting for the cry. My brain couldn't accept the silence. Only this time, I was listening for the absence of one. The quiet was loud. It was a hole in the night. I missed the sound that had tormented me. No chain scraping, no thin cry slipping through the cracks in the windows. The acoustic landscape was flat. The distress signal had stopped. Peace had returned, but it felt like loss. You'd think that would make it easier to sleep. Logic says, quiet leads to rest. Logic says the problem is solved. But the heart doesn't follow logic. It didn't. I tossed and turned. The sheets felt rough. The silence kept me awake, wondering if she was warm, if she was alone in a cage. Instead, my mind walked backward to our first Christmas in this house, when the paint was fresh, and our backs didn't hurt so much. I retreated into nostalgia. I summoned the ghosts of the past to fill the empty room. I replayed the greatest hits of our family life. There'd been a tree in the corner, crooked but bright, and the living room was crowded with wrapping paper and little feet. The memory was Technicolor. I could hear the ripping paper. I could smell the cookies. I could feel the energy of a young family. Our son had fallen asleep on the floor, with his face buried in the neck of the dog we had then, her tail thumping softly while the lights blinked over both of them. It was the perfect image of peace, boy and dog, safe and warm. It was what a home is supposed to look like. The noise back then felt endless. It was a cacophony of shouting, laughing, barking, TV. We thought it would never stop. We complained about it then. I remember stepping into the hallway just to catch my breath from all the joy. It was overwhelming. It was too much life in one room. Now I was starving for just a scrap of that chaos. Now the same walls watched 2 old people move slowly from chair to chair. We were the curators of the museum. We moved carefully, preserving the silence. We were fading into the furniture. The only new sound? The ticking of the kitchen clock and the refrigerator humming. The appliances were the loudest things in the house. They marked the passage of time without meaning. They were the soundtrack of waiting for the end. All that history, and still it felt like something was missing that we'd only just met. The past wasn't enough, we needed a future. And the future had 4 legs and was sitting in a cage across town. We had almost finished our tea when the phone rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet. It startled us both. The tea sloshed in the cup. It was an intrusion from the outside world. My wife picked it up, listened, then put it on speaker so I could hear. She shared the news instantly. She wanted me to be a witness. Her hand hovered over the phone, protective and anxious. "This is the clinic," a kind voice said. "She's stable. She's a fighter. But we have a problem with space over the holidays. Can I ask you both a difficult question?" The preamble was polite, but loaded. The butt was doing a lot of heavy lifting. We knew what was coming. There are questions you know the answer to before anyone even asks them on the phone. The intuition kicked in. We looked at each other. The air in the kitchen changed pressure. The woman from the clinic cleared her throat. She was nervous. She didn't want to impose. She was advocating for her patient. "With this cold and the holidays, we're short on space," she said. "We were wondering if you might consider taking the German Shepherd puppy home, at least as a temporary foster, just so she doesn't have to spend Christmas in a cage." She framed it as a favor. She framed it as temporary. She gave us an out, but she appealed to our conscience. My first instinct was to say no. The reflex of self-preservation fired. No chaos, no mess, no vet bills. Keep the life simple. My knees already sounded like old floorboards when I stood up. The body voted no. The aches voted no. The fatigue voted no. My blood pressure pillbox rattled louder than my car keys. The pharmacy on the counter was a reminder of my frailty. I was a patient myself. How could I care for another one? A young dog, especially a German Shepherd puppy, isn't exactly a small project. They are high energy. They chew, they run. They need a leader, not a retiree. What if we're gone before she is? I asked before I could stop myself. The darkest fear spoke out loud. The fear of dying and leaving her behind again. It was the responsibility of mortality. The word surprised me, hanging there between us like frost in the air. I had named the elephant in the room. I had admitted we were old. It was a brutal truth to put on the breakfast table. After we hung up, my wife and I sat at the kitchen table under the yellow lamp. The light pooled on the formica. We sat in the cone of silence. We had a decision to make. No music, no TV, just the hum of the fridge and the question between us. The question took up all the space. To take her or not? To open the door or lock it? We're too old for a puppy, she said first, staring at her hands. She was looking at her knuckles, swollen with arthritis. She was being practical. She was saying what everyone would say. We can't walk her like she deserves. We'll trip over her toys. You hate getting up at night. And what if one of us ends up in the hospital? She listed the risks. The falls. The sleep deprivation. The medical emergencies. It was a solid case against adoption. I nodded because every word made sense. Logic was on her side. Reason was on her side. The statistics were on her side. My body had been telling me we were done with big responsibilities. I had retired for a reason. I wanted rest. I wanted ease. We'd earned our quiet. We had raised kids. We had worked jobs. We had paid our dues. Why start over? But she added after a moment, do you remember how she leaned into my wrist when you cut that chain? The counter argument. The emotional trump card. The memory of the touch. Her voice softened. She didn't fight. She just gave herself over to us, like she decided we were her last chance. She saw the trust. She saw the surrender. She felt the weight of being chosen. Remember when you said we were too old for a cat? She added, a small smile creeping in. She used history against me. She reminded me of my past failures to resist. She teased me with my own soft heart. That was 20 years ago. We still ended up feeding every stray on the block. She pointed out the pattern. We were serial rescuers. We couldn't help ourselves. It was who we were. We went back and forth like that for a long time. The tennis match of logic versus love. The pros and cons list. The negotiation with fate. Reasons why we shouldn't. Memories of every animal that had slipped into our life anyway. The fear of loving something we might have to say goodbye to. The bigger fear of doing nothing and trying to live with that. The fear of loss is the price of love. We weighed the cost. Maybe we don't have 20 years, I said finally, but we have this Christmas, and she has right now. I reframed the timeline. Forget the decade. Look at the day. Live in the present. As if the house had been waiting for that sentence, the doorbell rang. The timing was cinematic. The universe punctuated my sentence. Fate knocked on the door. We looked at each other, then shuffled to the front hall. We moved in unison. We knew who it was. The anticipation was electric. On the porch stood a volunteer from the clinic, shoulders dusted with snow, holding a carrier. He was a delivery man of destiny. He brought the package. He smiled, knowing he had won. Inside, curled on a blanket, was the puppy wearing a tiny red Christmas scarf. It was a manipulative touch, the scarf. It was adorable. It broke down the last defense. She looked like a gift. I thought, he said gently, it might be easier to decide if you looked her in the eyes. He knew the game. He knew we couldn't say no to the face. He was a closer. The first night, she didn't understand what a home was. The concept of walls was foreign. The concept of safety was suspicious. She expected the wind. We carried the crate into the hallway and opened the door, and the German Shepherd puppy stayed curled on the blanket, blinking up at us like someone might still change their mind. She waited for the eviction. She waited for the trick. She didn't dare to hope. When she finally stepped out, one paw at a time, She tested the rug as if it might disappear right under her feet. She treated the carpet like ice. She walked on eggshells. She was ready to bolt. She moved slow, circling close, free of the chain, but still walking like something heavy was hanging from her neck. The phantom chain was still there. Her muscle memory was shaped by the restraint. She walked in a small arc. Her nose traced the air, catching the smells of old wood, laundry soap, the stew my wife had left on the stove. She was mapping the new world. She was cataloging the sense of domesticity. It was sensory overload. A floorboard creaked and she flinched, then eased when my wife's hand slid gently along her shoulder, fingers in the damp fur. The touch grounded her. The hand replaced the fear. We became her calm. We ran warm water in the tub, shallow and quiet. The bathroom became a spa. The steam rose. We prepared the baptism of cleaning. Getting her in took patience and soft words, but once the heat touched her skin, the worst of the shaking stopped. The water melted the tension. The warmth penetrated the bone. She sighed, a long release of trauma. We washed away the dirt and frozen clumps, one small patch at a time, and she just stood there blinking at us like she didn't know kindness could last more than a second. We scrubbed off the neglect. We revealed the dog underneath. She accepted the care with stunned silence. In the kitchen, we set a clean bowl on an old mat by the table. It was a dedicated spot. It was her place. It was the first piece of property she owned. She ate in small, careful bites, pausing to look up, ready to back away if we reached for the bowl. She checked for resource guarding. She checked for aggression. She realized the food was hers alone. We didn't. We just watched her. We stood back. We gave her space. We respected her meal. Two old people in worn slippers, feeling something settle inside us with every mouthful she finished. We were fed by her eating. Her nourishment was our nourishment. The house felt fuller. That night, when the lights were off, she whimpered from the next room. The darkness brought the ghosts back. The silence was scary again. She needed reassurance. Not loud, just a thin, lost sound, like the chain was still on her in her sleep. It was the nightmare of the yard. It was the PTSD surfacing. It broke the quiet. I got up more times than my back liked, sat on the floor beside her bed, and let her lean her weight against my leg until her breathing slowed. I became the anchor. I sacrificed my sleep. I kept the vigil. On one of those trips, tired and sore, I found myself talking to her in the dark. The darkness invites secrets. I whispered to the shadows. I bonded with the beast. You need a name, I told her. Hard to save someone you can't even call. The identity crisis needed solving. She wasn't enough anymore. We needed a proper noun. A word I'd read years ago came back to me, Leora. It floated up from memory. It felt right. It felt ancient and new. Something to do with light. The meaning mattered. She was the spark in the winter. She was the sun returning. You came to us like light on the coldest day, I said. Let's call you Leora. I christened her in the moonlight. I gave her a title. She was no longer a stray. Morning crept in through the curtains, gray and soft. The light changed. The day began. The world was different now. When I swung my feet to the floor, they touched something warm. Contact. Living fur. A solid presence. There she was, Leora, stretched out beside the bed, her head resting on my old house shoe, finally sleeping deep and quiet, as if she decided at last that this place might really be hers. She had moved from the crate to the bedside. She had chosen her pack. She was home. We thought we'd saved her from the cold. We thought the mission was temperature. We thought the battle was physical. We were wrong. Turned out cold is easier to escape than the memories that live under it. The frostbite heals. The fur grows back. The mind is harder to fix. In the days after we brought her home, Leora started to look more like a German shepherd puppy again, and less like a shadow. Her ears stood up. Her coat shone. She filled out. She ate with more confidence, even trotted down the hallway with a toy in her mouth once, as if the idea of play had finally knocked on the right door. A glimmer of childhood returned, a spark of joy, a moment of normal dog behavior. But certain sounds cracked something inside her. Triggers lay hidden in the domestic noise. Minds buried in the floorboards. The trauma was waiting. If a metal hanger slipped off the rod in the closet, she'd freeze, eyes wide, tail tucked so tight it almost disappeared. The sound of metal, on metal, was the enemy. It sounded like the chain, It sounded like the stake. If a door slammed by accident, she'd let out a sharp bark and then scramble to find a place to disappear, breathing fast, heart pounding against the floor. Loud noises meant danger. Sudden movements meant pain. She sought the bunker. One afternoon, a few days before New Year's, some kids from down the street were out back with those cheap little poppers. Just harmless paper and powder. They were celebrating early. They were just playing. They didn't know. They laughed as they pulled the strings. Tiny explosions echoing against the snow. Snap. Crack. Pop. It sounded like gunfire to a nervous system. The first pop sounded and Leora vanished. She didn't run, she teleported. The flight response was instantaneous. She sought the deepest hole. By the time I got to the kitchen, she was wedged under the table, pressed flat against the wall, shaking so hard her nails clicked against the tile. She was trying to merge with the drywall. She was vibrating with terror. She was back in the yard. Her chest heaved, eyes unfocused, like she'd been yanked back to that frozen yard all over again. The flashback was total. She wasn't in a warm kitchen. She was trapped in the cold. I knew that feeling too well. The resonance was deep. I recognized the panic. I knew the demon. It's the same one I had as a boy, hiding at the back of a closet while voices rose in the other room, or later, when certain sounds brought back things I'd tried to bury. I had my own ghosts. I had my own closets. We were veterans of different wars. Your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. The somatic memory holds on. The cells remember the fear. The reflex is faster than thought. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I abandoned dignity. I abandoned my knees. I joined her in the bunker. I slid down onto the kitchen floor, bones protesting, and stretched out beside her. I got on her level. I entered her world. I lay on the cold tile. I didn't reach for her right away. I respected the fear. I didn't crowd her. I just offered proximity. I just lay there and started talking in a low voice, like I was telling a bedtime story to both of us. The drone of the voice was the medicine. The narrative was the soothing balm. I wove a blanket of words. I told her about being small and scared, about the nights when the shouting in our house got so loud I'd slip outside and sit on the back steps, and the dog we had then would come lean against my side until the noise in my chest quieted down. I shared my trauma. I told her she wasn't alone. I told her dogs had saved me before. How sometimes the only thing that kept me from running away was the weight of her head on my knees, the anchor of love, the reason to stay, the saving grace of a pet. As I talked, Leora's breathing began to change. The rhythm synced with mine. The panic subsided. The hyperventilation stopped. Her tremors slowed, became little shivers, then long sighs. The adrenaline burned off. The muscles relaxed. The storm passed. Finally, she inched closer, laid her head right on my chest, and let out one deep, tired breath, like she'd put her fear down for just a moment. She bridged the gap. She trusted the man on the floor. She rested her burden on my heart. I kept going, saying things I hadn't said out loud in 50 years, while her eyes drifted closed and her body grew heavy against me. It was a confessional. It was therapy. I healed a piece of myself while healing her. By the time my wife peeked in, both of us were lying there on the kitchen floor, one old man and one young dog, stitched together by the things we survived. We were a heap of broken parts making a whole. We were a tableau of survival. She saw the bond. The next morning, with Leora dozing at my feet, the phone rang again. The outside world calling. The administrative reality check. The deadline approaching. It was the shelter. The polite voice returned. The paperwork needed processing. The system needed an answer. Their voice gentle, but businesslike. They weren't pushing, but they were asking. They needed the bed or the signature. Technically, she's still under our care, they said. We need to update her status. Are you ready to decide if Leora is staying with you for good? The moment of truth. The fork in the road. The final question. At 67, you don't really expect there to be anything under the tree for you. You expect socks. You expect cards. You don't expect life-changing gifts. Mostly, you're just grateful the lights still work, and the coffee's hot. The bar is low. The joys are small. Contentment is the goal. That Christmas, the house felt different before anyone even knocked. The energy had shifted. The static was gone. The house felt alive. Leora padded from room to room, sniffing at the tinsel, pausing by the window every time a car door shut outside. She was the spirit of the holiday. She was investigating the magic. She was guarding the joy. When our daughter finally came in with the grandkids, coats and scarves and noise, they all stopped short in the doorway. The invasion of the family. The chaos returned. Then the silence of awe. "Wow," our grandson said. "She's big." The sheer size of the puppy surprised them. She was a wolf in the living room. She was impressive. Our daughter gave me that look, the one that tries to be gentle and worried at the same time. The "are you senile" look, the concern for the aging parent, the skepticism. "Are you sure you two can handle a German Shepherd?" she asked quietly. "It's a lot, Dad." She voiced the reasonable doubt. She was the voice of the world, telling us we were too old. She was wrong. Before I could answer, Leora walked over to the smallest of the kids, who was clutching a soft, stuffed snowman. The dog moved with purpose. She ignored the adults. She targeted the child. She lowered her head, took the toy from those tiny hands with the slowest, most careful grip, then laid it back down in the little girl's lap, and wagged once, as if to say, "I'll play your way." It was a demonstration of gentleness. It was a peace offering. It was pure instinct. Later, when the noise settled and the dinner dishes were done, my wife sank into her favorite chair with a small groan. The feast was over. The fatigue set in. The house quieted down. Without being called, Leora crossed the room and rested her head gently on my wife's knees, breathing in sync with her, like she'd appointed herself guardian of tired bones. She knew who the matriarch was. She offered comfort. She paid her rent in love. I sat by the fireplace, and somehow the stories I told that night didn't come out as heavy. The mood was lighter. The shadows were gone. The presence of the dog changed the narrative. Same memories, same years, but the context had shifted. The bitterness was gone. The loneliness was gone. But there was Leora stretched at my feet, warm and solid, glancing up every time my voice broke and staying right where she was until I found it again. She was the emotional support. She was the anchor. She kept me steady. On the coffee table next to the half-empty cookie plate lay a neat stack of papers from the shelter. The contract. The legal binding. The adoption certificate. No legal drama. No big speeches. Just a line for a signature that meant Leora wasn't going anywhere else after this. It was a simple act. Pen on paper. A life changed with ink. We signed them there by the fire, my hand shaking more than I'd admit, and my wife slid her hand over mine when I set the pen down. We signed together. We committed together. It was a second wedding vow. We don't know how many Christmases we've got left in this house, but I know this one won't be forgotten. The future is uncertain. The end is coming. But this moment is eternal. Not by her, not by us, and maybe not by whoever is watching this and thinking about the dog they heard crying somewhere once. The story ripples out. The memory persists. The legacy is established. When the house finally went quiet again, Leora curled up on her bed by the fireplace, still wearing that faded red Christmas scarf the clinic gave her. She was the centerpiece. She was the gift that breathed. She was the heart of the room. The glow from the tree lights flickered over her fur as I tucked a small blanket around her back. I performed the nightly ritual. I ensured her warmth. I worshipped at the altar of the dog. She sighed in her sleep, one paw twitching, as if chasing something better in her dreams. She was running in green fields. She was chasing rabbits. She was free. And all it took for this little miracle to happen was that we didn't shut the window the night we heard her cry, the pivotal moment. The choice to listen, the refusal to ignore. It might feel like your best days are behind you, the lie of aging, the feeling of obsolescence, the belief that the story is over. I used to think the same thing until the night I heard a puppy crying in the snow. The catalyst for change, the wake-up call, the proof of life. If you're my age, you know what it's like to slow down, the deceleration, the stiffness, the world moving too fast. Your back argues with you. Your knees have their own opinions. The body becomes a noisy roommate. It complains. And you start believing the world should ask its big questions to someone younger? You abdicate responsibility. You step back. You think you are done. But helping someone smaller than you doesn't need youth. Compassion isn't a sport. Kindness doesn't require cartilage. It just requires will. It just needs a moment when you say, "Not on my watch," the line in the sand, the moral stance, the decision to act. Leora gave us a new rhythm to our days, a reason to open the curtains earlier, to talk more softly in the mornings, to laugh at the way she trips over her own paws when she's excited. She reset the clock, she brought music back, she brought laughter. She brought warmth into a house that had gotten far too quiet. She filled the void. She chased out the ghosts. She made the house a home again. And all because we listened, really listened, when no one else did. The power of attention. The miracle of hearing. The act of witnessing. There are so many dogs like her out there, cold, waiting, hoping someone hears them. The world is full of cries. The need is endless. The snow is deep. Most of them don't need a hero. They don't need Superman. They don't need a miracle. They just need one person who decides not to walk back inside and pretend they didn't hear anything. They need a witness. They need a neighbor. They need you. Sharing stories like this helps more than you think. The algorithm of hope, the digital ripple, the spread of awareness. Every time someone watches or likes or shares a video like this, it reaches another pair of ears. The network grows, the message travels, the rescue expands. Maybe someone in your town will hear crying in the snow one night and remember Leora. The inspiration strikes, the memory triggers action, a life is saved by a story. Maybe they'll pick up the phone, or step outside, or open their car door, and make room for a life that didn't have any left. The chain of events. The domino effect of kindness. We can be quiet heroes, you and I. No fanfare, no press conference. Just decent people doing decent things. We don't need capes. We don't need powers. We just need ears. We just need heart, and a few moments where we choose compassion over convenience. The choice is simple. The cost is low. The reward is infinite. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. Support the system. Fund the rescuers. Value the work. Caring for a rescued puppy is more than love. It's work. It's grit. It's patience. It's responsibility. It's a job. It's a duty. It's a vow. It's pet care. It's the daily grind. It's the vet visits. It's the food bowl. Subscribe to Whisker Tales. Join the community. Watch the stories. Feel the love. Be their voice. Speak up. Shout it out. Don't be silent. Be their hope. Be the light. Be the open door. Be the one who listens.